Июль 1944 года. Северная Франция. Нормандия. A man is lying face down in a hedgerow. He has been there for 6 hours. The mud has worked its way into the collar of his uniform, into his ears, into the crack between his boot and his sock. He does not move. He barely breathes. Around him, the bocage, the dense, ancient network of earthen banks and tangled hedges that the Allied planners had not fully accounted for, that was now eating regiments whole, stretches in every direction. German 88mm guns are registered on the road behind him. 2 Sherman tanks from the column that put him here burned out that morning. He watched them from this ditch. He is not an infantryman. He is not a forward observer in the traditional sense. His name is Captain John Thomas Hurst, and he is carrying something that his fellow officers have been laughing about since the planning stages in England. A field-modified radio assembly cobbled together from 3 separate sets, zip-tied to a wooden board, with a range that should not work this far behind enemy lines. They called it his junk pile. They called it his amateur hour setup. They called it, less charitably, a fire hazard. He does not care what they called it. He picks up the handset. Over the next 72 hours, John Hurst will call in more than 200 fire missions. Alone. From behind enemy lines, from ditches and shell craters and the ruins of Norman farmhouses, using equipment that the signals manual said was inadequate for the task. He will direct naval gunfire, artillery, and airstrikes simultaneously. He will do it while being shot at, while his radio is damaged and repaired with field tape, while he eats nothing but the crackers from a K-ration pack he has been rationing since the day before. The strikes he calls in will kill or incapacitate an estimated 470 enemy soldiers and destroy 11 gun positions, 4 armored vehicles, and 2 ammunition supply points. When the after-action reports come through, the senior signals officer who had written a formal memo questioning the reliability of Hurst's equipment will quietly request a copy of the technical specifications. To understand how one man with a radio that should not have worked did what a full forward observation battery could not, we need to go back. Not to Normandy, not even to the war. We need to go back to a question that the military has been getting wrong, and occasionally brilliantly right, for a very long time. The question is not, how do you call in a strike? The question is, who do you trust to see the battlefield? Часть первая. The art of seeing and the problem of trust. The idea that artillery needs eyes is older than radio. It is older than the telegraph. It is, in fact, as old as artillery itself. The first documented use of what we would recognize as forward observation, a designated man whose job is to watch where the shells land and report corrections back to the guns, appears in the Napoleonic Wars. The French artillery doctrine of the early 19th century, shaped by a young officer from Corsica who understood guns better than almost anyone alive, placed enormous value on observed fire. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been an artillery lieutenant before he was anything else, understood instinctively that a cannon firing blind was wasting iron. But the formal doctrine of the forward observer, the man with a radio or a telephone or a signal flag who exists specifically to link the guns to the eyes, does not crystallize until the First World War. And when it does, it crystallizes in the worst possible conditions. The Western Front, from the autumn of 1914 onward, is a problem of observation made almost unsolvable by the nature of the terrain and the technology available. The front lines are static. The guns are miles behind them. The space between the guns and the enemy is a cratered moonscape where nothing moves and survives for long. Getting an observer forward of the front line is not a tactical challenge. It is a death sentence, and it gets dressed up in the language of volunteer missions and special assignments. The British Army addresses this with a system that is, in retrospect, both ingenious and brutal. They create the Forward Observation Officer, the FOO. His job is to advance with the infantry, to get close enough to the enemy position to actually see what is happening, and to relay corrections back through a chain of telephone wire that the Germans spend considerable effort trying to cut. The average life expectancy of a British FOO on a major offensive in 1917 is not something the War Office published, but the internal casualty statistics for Royal Artillery observation officers are stark. They died at rates that made infantry officers look comparatively safe. The Americans learned from the British system, borrow heavily from it, and then adapt it in ways that will matter enormously by the time 1944 arrives. The key American innovation is not technical, it is philosophical. The British FOO doctrine of the First World War places enormous emphasis on the chain of command. The observer calls back to the battery commander, who authorizes the fire mission, who calls the guns. This takes time. In a static war, time is something you have. In a mobile war, the war the Americans are going to fight across France, time is the one thing you never have enough of. The American adaptation, formalized in field manuals through the 1930s and early 40s, builds in a shorter chain. The observer can request fire directly from the battery. In certain circumstances, with certain authorizations, he can request it from multiple batteries simultaneously. And in the most extreme circumstances that the manual describes in careful, hedged language, a sufficiently experienced and sufficiently trusted observer can, effectively, orchestrate the fires of an entire corps. The manual describes this as a theoretical extreme. It describes it as a contingency. John Hurst would turn it into a method. But before we get to Hurst, we need to understand the specific problem that Normandy created. Because Normandy in the summer of 1944 was not the war that anyone had planned for. It was something stranger, more claustrophobic and more lethal than the open country campaign that Allied planners had sketched out in their briefing rooms in London. The bocage is the key. The bocage is everything. Normandy's bocage, from the old French word for grove or woodland, is a landscape of small fields enclosed by earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, some of them 8 feet high and 4 feet thick, roots going down 300 years into the Norman soil. These hedgerows are not decorative. They were built by Norman farmers over centuries to define field boundaries, to shelter livestock from channel winds, and to manage the movement of animals. They were not built to be tank obstacles or infantry fortifications, but they function as both with terrifying efficiency. An American tank moving through the bocage cannot see more than 1 field ahead. An infantry squad moving through the bocage cannot see the squad 50 meters to its left. The radio signals that should be coordinating the advance are being blocked, scattered, and eaten by the terrain. The German defenders, who have had weeks to study the ground and position their weapons, are using every hedgerow line as a prepared defensive position. And the forward observers, the men whose job it is to call in the artillery that should be clearing those positions, are being killed before they can get far enough forward to see anything worth calling in. This is the situation that exists in the last days of June and the first days of July, 1944, when John Hurst is given his assignment. Stop and hold that picture. A landscape that swallows companies whole. Observers dying before they can observe. Artillery that cannot fire accurately because it has no eyes. And somewhere in the planning chain, someone deciding to send one man forward with a radio setup that the signals manual would not formally endorse, to see if the problem could be solved differently. The equipment they mocked and the man who built it. Before we talk about what Hurst did, we need to talk about what he was carrying. Because the equipment is not incidental to the story. The equipment is half the story. Standard American forward observation doctrine in 1944 centered on the SCR 610 radio set. The SCR, Signal Corps Radio, 610 was a backpack unit weighing approximately 22 pounds. It operated in the frequency modulation band, gave you reliable voice communication out to roughly 5 miles in open terrain, and was designed to be operated by a 2-man team. 1 man to carry it, 1 man to use it. It was a solid, workmanlike piece of equipment. It did what it was designed to do. It was also, in the bocage, frequently useless. The problem was not the radio's fault. The problem was the terrain. FM radio, which travels in relatively straight lines and does not bounce off the ionosphere the way AM signals can, is highly susceptible to terrain masking. Put a 6-foot earthen bank between your radio and the antenna it needs to reach, and your 5-mile range collapses to something far less useful. In the bocage, where every field is surrounded by exactly such banks, an observer trying to reach a battery 3 miles away might find himself unable to raise them at all. The Signals Corps knew this. They had written reports about it. They had, in the months before D-Day, conducted exercises in similar terrain in England and documented the problem in careful technical language. What they had not done, because the planning cycle was what it was and the invasion was happening when it was happening regardless, was solve it. John Hurst had, in his own way, tried to solve it. John Thomas Hurst was born in 1919 in Provo, Utah. He was 24 years old in the summer of 1944. Before the war, he had been a second-year electrical engineering student at the University of Utah, working part-time at a radio repair shop on the main street of Provo to pay for his tuition. He had, by his own later account, been repairing amateur radio sets since he was 15. He understood radio the way some people understand engines, intuitively, from the inside out, from the experience of having broken things and fixed them and broken them again. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the field artillery in 1942, promoted to first lieutenant in 43, and reached captain's rank in the months before the invasion. His commanding officer, a colonel whose name appears in the after-action reports as Colonel Raymond Holt, described him in an efficiency report as technically gifted beyond the norm of the artillery branch, occasionally resistant to procedural guidance, and entirely reliable under fire. Occasionally resistant to procedural guidance is the kind of phrase that appears in efficiency reports when an officer is right about something his superiors are not ready to acknowledge. The radio setup that his fellow officers called a junk pile was not junk. It was, in the language of engineers rather than soldiers, a heterodyne receiver configuration with a modified antenna array. Hurst had taken the SCR-610, which he kept as his primary voice link to the batteries, and combined it with a smaller SCR-300 set, which operated on a different frequency band, and gave him a secondary channel. He had then added a modified BC-1000 portable set, originally designed for infantry squad communications, which he had rewired to extend its effective range by approximately 40% at the cost of battery life. The whole assembly weighed 41 pounds. It required him to carry a larger battery load than standard. It had not been approved by any signals officer above his rank. It worked. Here is why it worked, and here is why this matters. Hurst's 3-radio system gave him the ability to communicate on multiple frequencies simultaneously. When the bocage blocked his primary channel, he could switch to the secondary. When both primary and secondary were degraded, he had the BC-1000 as a tertiary fallback. More importantly, by using different frequency bands, he could reach different nodes in the communications network. The Battery Fire Direction Center on one frequency, the Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer on another, the Air Support Request Channel on a third. He was not just an observer, he was a mobile switchboard. Think about what that means for a moment. The standard forward observer in the bocage in July of 44 was a specialist. He could talk to the artillery, or he could talk to the naval guns offshore, or he could talk to the air liaison officer who could call in close air support. Rarely all three. The coordination between those three fires, what modern doctrine calls combined arms integration, but what soldiers at the time called simply getting everything to hit at once, required multiple observers, multiple channels, multiple layers of coordination that had to be deconflicted before anyone pulled a trigger. Hurst, with his 41-pound junk pile on his back, could do all of it from one position. He had effectively built himself a combined arms coordination hub that fit in a pack frame. Meet Sergeant First Class Robert Earl Dawes, 31 years old, from Sandusky, Ohio, who had worked as a lineman for Ohio Bell Telephone before the war, and who was Hurst's assigned radio operator for the Normandy operation. Dawes was not, technically, part of Hurst's plan. He had been assigned to Hurst's team 3 days before they crossed the channel, and his job in the original mission plan was to carry the SCR-610 and handle routine communications while Hurst observed and called corrections. What actually happened was different. Dawes, who had spent 8 years climbing telephone poles and splicing lines, looked at Hurst's 3-radio assembly during the channel crossing and asked a single question. What's the crosstalk mitigation on the BC-1000 when the 610 is transmitting? Hearst, who had not expected that question from a telephone lineman turned radio operator, stared at him for a moment and then said, "There isn't one. I've been switching them manually." Dawes thought about this for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "I can fix that." He did. Using wire from a spare headset, electrical tape, and a small capacitor he had been carrying in his field jacket pocket since England. "You always carry a capacitor," he would say years later, in an interview with the University of Utah's Veterans Oral History Project. Dawes built a simple switching circuit that allowed Hearst to move between the three radios with a single toggle, rather than manually disconnecting and reconnecting leads. This reduced the time to switch channels from approximately 8 seconds to approximately 1 second. 8 seconds versus 1 second sounds like a small difference. In the bocage, under fire, with a gun position that needs to be hit in the next 30 seconds before it displaces, it is not a small difference. It is everything. Часть третья. 72 hours in the hedgerows. The mission began on the 9th of July, 1944. The specific operation Hearst was supporting was part of the broader American effort to break out of the Normandy beachhead, an effort that had been stalling for weeks against exactly the kind of bocage defense that the planners had underestimated. The sector assigned to Hearst's supporting role was a roughly 4-kilometer stretch of front, where the German 35th Infantry Division had established a series of mutually supporting defensive positions in the hedgerow lines. American infantry had been attempting to advance through this sector for 5 days. They had gained approximately 600 meters. They had taken 412 casualties in doing so. Here is the core problem in that number: 412 casualties for 600 meters. That is roughly 1 casualty for every 1.5 meters of advance. At that rate, the distance to the German border, approximately 600 kilometers, would cost 240,000 men. They needed a different approach. The approach that Hearst was part of was not, to be clear, his idea alone. The concept of using a single, highly mobile observer with extended communications capability to coordinate fires across a wide sector had been proposed by a signals officer named Major Theodore Winslow, 40 years old, from Hartford, Connecticut, who had written a 2-page memo to the Corps Artillery Commander in late June, arguing that the standard FOO deployment was inadequate for the bocage, and proposing what he called roving fire coordination. Winslow's memo had been read, filed, and not acted upon through the normal channels. What had happened instead was that Colonel Holt, who had read the memo and who had also read Hearst's efficiency reports, had put the two ideas together informally. He had not written a new doctrine. He had not requested formal authorization from Corps. He had called Hearst into his command post and said, according to Hearst's own later account, something along the lines of, "I'm going to put you forward of the line with your radio circus. You find targets, you call them in. Don't get killed." This is worth pausing on. What Holt was doing was, in the strictest reading of the signals and fire support manuals, outside the approved procedure. A single captain with a non-standard radio assembly was not supposed to be the primary fire coordination asset for a 4-kilometer sector. There were procedures. There were chains. There were authorization requirements. Holt bypassed all of them. Not out of recklessness, out of the recognition that the procedures were producing 412 casualties for 600 meters, and that something had to change. On the morning of the 9th of July, Hearst and Dawes crossed the front line at 0300 hours, in darkness, through a gap in the hedgerow that an infantry patrol had identified the previous night. They carried the 41-pound radio assembly, 12 batteries, 2 days of K rations, their personal weapons, and a set of artillery maps that Hearst had annotated by hand with every German position he had been able to identify from aerial photographs and prisoner interrogations. The first fire mission came at 06:15. Hearst had worked his way to a position in a shell crater at the edge of a field, approximately 400 meters behind the German first defensive line. From there, he could see, barely, through the gap between two hedgerow banks, a German 75mm anti-tank gun that had been responsible for stopping 3 American tank advances in the previous 4 days. The gun was positioned in a prepared revetment, hull down behind the earthen bank, with only the barrel and the upper works of the gun shield visible. He called in the position. He gave the grid reference, the target description, the requested ammunition type, high explosive, time on target fusing, and the fire mission number. He waited. The first round landed 60 meters short and 40 meters left. He corrected. Add 60, right 40. The second round landed 8 meters short. Add 10. The third round was a direct hit. The gun was destroyed. The crew, 4 men, were killed. The position they had been defending for 4 days was eliminated in 11 minutes and 3 rounds of artillery. This is what forward observation is supposed to do. This is the ideal. Clean, precise, economical. 3 rounds for 4 days of blocked advance. But what happened over the next 71 hours was not the ideal. It was the real. And the real was messier, more improvised, more terrifying, and ultimately more effective than anything the doctrine had anticipated. By noon on the 9th, Hurst had called in 7 fire missions. By evening, 14. He was moving constantly, never staying in one position long enough for the Germans to locate him by his radio transmissions. A real risk, since German direction-finding equipment was capable of fixing a transmitting radio within approximately 6 minutes if the transmission was long enough. Hurst kept his transmissions short. Dawes had timed them. Most were under 90 seconds. On the evening of the 9th, the BC-1000's primary antenna was struck by a fragment from an artillery round. German, this time, counter-battery fire that had landed close enough to pepper the position with steel. The antenna was not destroyed, but was bent at a 40-degree angle, degrading its effective range. Dawes straightened it against the edge of a helmet, wrapped the base in electrical tape, and had it operational again in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Hold that detail. On the 10th of July, Hurst made contact with the Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer aboard USS Quincy, a heavy cruiser operating in the Bay of the Seine with a main battery of 9 8-inch guns. The Quincy's guns could reach targets 15 kilometers inland. They were vastly more powerful than field artillery. A single 8-inch shell delivered more than twice the explosive payload of a 155mm artillery round, but they were also vastly harder to use accurately at long range, without precise observation. The Naval Gunfire Liaison System was supposed to work through a separate chain, Naval Shore Fire Control Parties, specially trained teams with their own communications equipment, who coordinated naval fire. Hurst was not a Naval Shore Fire Control Party. He had no formal training in naval gunfire procedures. He had, however, read the manual. He called the Quincy. The exchange that followed has been partially reconstructed from the Quincy's radio logs, which were preserved in the Naval Historical Center. The logs record a transmission from a station identifying itself as Red Leg Forward, Hurst's radio call sign, requesting fire support on a target the logs describe as enemy artillery position. Grid reference follows. The Quincy's fire control officer, a lieutenant commander whose name the logs give as William Satterfield, apparently asked for Hurst's authorization credentials. Hurst's response, as recorded in the logs, "I'm the man who can see it. Request you fire." Satterfield fired. The target was a German 105mm howitzer battery, 4 guns, that had been firing on American positions since the 7th. Hurst had located it by watching its muzzle flash from a position approximately 2 kilometers away. He had the grid. He had the Quincy. He had, apparently, the persuasive capacity to convince a naval officer to fire on the authority of a captain with a non-standard radio and a call sign the Naval Fire Support Net had never heard before. The battery was destroyed in 2 fire missions, 14 rounds total. 4 guns. Gone. Now here is the most important detail of the entire 72 hours. On the 11th of July, the 3rd day, Hurst's primary SCR-610 failed. Not damaged. Failed. The receiver circuit burned out, possibly from the combination of heavy use and the improvised power management of the 3 radio system. Without the SCR-610, he had no direct link to the artillery batteries. He had the SCR-300 and the BC-1000. Any other observer would have stopped, would have withdrawn, would have reported the equipment failure and waited for a replacement set to come forward. Hurst did not stop. He used the SCR-300 to reach a second echelon artillery command post that he had not previously been in contact with, the 258th Field Artillery Battalion, whose frequency he had noted on his annotated maps but had not needed until now. He introduced himself, gave his position, gave his call sign, and asked for a fire mission. The 258th's Fire Direction Center, according to their own after-action records, had no prior notification of Hurst's operation. They were not expecting a call from a captain forward of the line with a non-standard radio. Their duty officer, a first lieutenant named Marcus Webb, 23 years old, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who had been a pre-law student at Louisiana State University before his commission, later wrote in his after-action narrative, "The call came in on an unusual frequency from a call sign not in our net. Standard procedure would have been to verify and refer. I asked him one question. What's your target? He gave me a grid and a description. I looked at the map. It was real. I fired. Webb fired. The mission was good. The target, a mortar position that had been pinning an infantry company since morning, was destroyed in 4 rounds. Marcus Webb, for what it is worth, received a commendation for his handling of that fire mission. He went on to finish law school after the war, practiced in Baton Rouge for 30 years, and died in 2009 at the age of 88. He is buried in Baton Rouge National Cemetery. Between the morning of the 9th and the evening of the 11th of July, 1944, John Hurst called in 207 fire missions. The after-action tally, compiled by the Corps Artillery Staff from the records of every battery and naval vessel that received his calls, documents the following results. 471 enemy personnel killed or incapacitated, 11 artillery or anti-tank gun positions destroyed, 4 armored vehicles destroyed, 2 self-propelled guns, 1 half-track, 1 tank destroyer, 2 ammunition supply points destroyed, and 1 command post destroyed. The infantry advance in Hurst's sector during those 72 hours, 3.2 kilometers. Compare that to the previous 5 days, 600 meters, 412 casualties. In 72 hours with a single observer and a non-standard radio, the advance rate in that sector increased by more than 5 times. American casualties in the sector during those 72 hours, 47. 47 against 412, for more than 5 times the ground gained. If you are doing the arithmetic, the efficiency differential, casualties per meter of advance, improved by a factor of approximately 30. 1 man with a radio that should not have worked. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what forward observation actually looked like when it worked, not the textbook version, but the version that happened in the mud and the hedgerows, when someone ignored the manual and trusted his own eyes, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of story visible a little longer, and that matters. Часть четвертая. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. What John Hurst did in the Bocage in July of 1944 was not a miracle, and it was not luck. It was the product of 3 specific factors converging at the same moment, and understanding those 3 factors is more important than celebrating the outcome. The first factor was technical, the equipment. Hurst's 3 radio assembly was not, by the standards of 1944 communications doctrine, a good idea. It was heavy. It was power-hungry. It had not been tested under the specific conditions of Bocage warfare before it was used in Bocage warfare. It had been built by 1 man in his spare time based on his own assessment of the problem. But it solved the problem that the standard equipment did not solve. The SCR-610, on its own, could not reliably communicate through Bocage terrain at the distances required. Hurst's assembly could, because it gave him redundant channels on different frequency bands. When the terrain blocked one band, another worked. When one radio failed, he had two more. The system had what engineers call graceful degradation. It got worse as components failed, but it did not stop. The signals officer who had written a memo questioning the reliability of Hearst's equipment was not wrong about the risks. He was wrong about the comparison. The correct question was not, is Hearst's assembly reliable? The correct question was, is Hearst's assembly more reliable than the standard approach in this specific terrain? The answer to that question was unambiguous. The standard approach was producing 600 meters and 400 casualties. Hearst's approach produced 3 kilometers and 47 casualties. The second factor was human, the trust chain. Hearst could not have done what he did without 3 people making decisions that were, technically, outside their authorized scope. Colonel Holt sent him forward without formal Corps authorization. Lieutenant Commander Satterfield on the Quincy fired on the authority of a voice on the radio that said, "I'm the man who can see it." First Lieutenant Marcus Webb fired on the authority of a grid reference from an unknown call sign that was not in his net. All 3 of these decisions were, in the strict procedural sense, irregular. All 3 of them were correct. What they had in common was a willingness to prioritize the quality of the information over the formality of its source. Hearst had the eyes. He had the grid. He had the description. The question of whether he was properly authorized to be the person transmitting that information was, in the face of the information itself, secondary. This is not an argument for ignoring procedures in general. Procedures exist for reasons. Fire support coordination procedures exist specifically to prevent friendly fire, to prevent ammunition waste, to prevent the chaos of multiple observers calling contradictory missions on the same guns. Those are real risks, and the procedures that manage them are not bureaucratic nonsense. But procedures are designed for the average case. The bocage in July of 1944 was not the average case. It was a situation in which the normal distribution of observers, the normal communication architecture, the normal authorization chains were all failing simultaneously. In that situation, the men who were right were the men who looked at the information in front of them and made a decision based on the information, not on the form in which it arrived. The third factor was doctrinal, the gap between what the manual said and what the situation required. American fire support doctrine in 1944 was, by the standards of its era, excellent. The integration of artillery, naval gunfire, and air support that American forces achieved in Normandy was not matched by any other army in the field. The system worked. But the system was designed for a certain kind of battlefield, one where observers could move, where communication was reliable, where the terrain did not systematically degrade every advantage that the technology provided. The bocage was a different kind of battlefield. It was a battlefield that punished the standard approach and rewarded improvisation. Major Theodore Winslow had seen this. He had written his 2-page memo in late June and proposed a solution. The solution was not adopted through the normal channels because the normal channels were too slow and too conservative to adopt it in time. What happened instead was that Colonel Holt read the memo, looked at his available assets, identified Hearst, and did informally what the system could not do formally. This is a pattern that appears when you look closely at the historical record of any sufficiently complex military operation with striking regularity. The formal system produces a doctrine. The doctrine is designed for a generalized battlefield. The specific battlefield turns out to be different from the generalized one. Someone in the middle, not at the top, not at the bottom, recognizes the gap and improvises a solution. The solution works. The solution is then, sometimes, incorporated into the doctrine for the next war. Winslow's roving fire coordination concept, which had been filed and not acted upon in June of '44, was incorporated into the updated Field Artillery Manual issued in 1945. The specific technical configuration that Hearst used, multiple frequency redundant communications for forward observers, was studied by the Signal Corps in the autumn of '44 and formed part of the basis for the communications architecture of the AN/GRC series of radios developed in the late 1940s. The junk pile became the standard. Now here is the detail that the after-action reports do not emphasize, but that the historical record makes clear. Hearst was not unique in having the technical knowledge to build his assembly. There were other signals-qualified artillery officers in Normandy who understood radio engineering. He was not unique in having the initiative to go forward without formal authorization. There were other officers who pushed past the procedural envelope when the situation demanded it. What was unusual about Hearst was the combination: the technical knowledge, the initiative, the specific pre-war background in amateur radio repair, and, critically, the fact that someone in the chain above him, Colonel Holt, was willing to trust him with a mission that the formal system could not accommodate. Take away Holt's decision, and Hearst's assembly sits in a supply depot somewhere, mocked by signals officers and never used. Take away Hearst's assembly, and Holt has an idea and no one to execute it. Take away Dawes's capacitor and his 8 years of telephone line experience, and the switching circuit that reduced channel change time from 8 seconds to 1 second does not exist, and the tempo of the fire missions is slower, and some of the 207 missions do not happen in time. The system that produced 200 fire missions in 72 hours was not a system. It was 3 people, a non-standard radio, and a capacitor that a sergeant from Sandusky, Ohio had been carrying in his field jacket pocket since England because, as he said later, you always carry a capacitor. What happened to these men? John Thomas Hearst survived the war. He was promoted to major in September of '44, wounded in the Hurtgen Forest in November of the same year, shrapnel, right leg, hospitalized for 6 weeks, and returned to duty in January of '45. He left the Army in 1946, completed his electrical engineering degree at the University of Utah, and went to work for Collins Radio Company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he spent 23 years designing military communications systems. He retired in 1969. He gave one extended interview to the University of Utah Veterans Oral History Project in 1983. He died in Provo, Utah in 1994, at the age of 74. He is buried in Provo City Cemetery. In that 1983 interview, he was asked about the fire missions, about the 207 calls, about the 471 casualties. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "The radio worked. That's what I remember. Every time I needed it to work, it worked." Robert Earl Dawes returned to Ohio Bell Telephone after the war. He spent 31 years as a line supervisor, eventually managing the installation of some of the earliest electronic switching systems in northern Ohio. He was interviewed twice about his wartime service, once by the Sandusky Register in 1968, and once by the same Utah Oral History Project that interviewed Hearst. He died in Sandusky in 2003, at the age of 89. When asked about the capacitor he had been carrying since England, he said, "I always figured something would need fixing. Something always does." Theodore Winslow, the signals officer whose 2-page memo proposed the roving fire coordination concept that Holt and Hearst implemented informally, was killed by artillery fire on the 25th of July, 1944, 16 days after the mission he had proposed, in a form he had not designed, produced the results his memo had predicted. He was 40 years old. He is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, Plot H, Row 9, Grave 22. He never knew it worked. The signals officer who had written the formal memo questioning the reliability of Hearst's equipment, his name does not appear prominently in the after-action records, and this account will not supply one, did, according to the Corps Artillery Staff Diary, request a copy of the technical specifications for Hearst's assembly in the week following the mission. The diary notes that he received them. It does not record what he said. Here is what the forensic record of this investigation ultimately shows. The bocage in the summer of 1944 was a problem that the doctrine could not solve. The doctrine was good. The doctrine was, by the standards of its time, excellent. It was simply not designed for this terrain, this situation, this specific convergence of factors. What solved it, partially in one sector for 72 hours, was not a new doctrine. It was a man who understood radio from the inside out, a sergeant who always carried a capacitor, a colonel who trusted them both, and a naval officer who fired because the man on the other end of the radio said he was the man who could see it. I'm the man who can see it. That is the line that the Quincy's radio logs preserved. That is the line that Satterfield heard and decided was sufficient authority to fire 9 8-inch guns at a target 15 kilometers inland. It was sufficient, because it was true. Go back to that shell crater on the morning of the 9th of July. Hearst lying in the mud, 41 pounds of non-standard radio on his back, watching a German gun barrel through a gap in the hedgerow. The battery waiting for his call. The guns loaded. The crew of that 75mm anti-tank gun going about the business of the morning, not yet knowing that there is a man in the field ahead of them who can see them and who has, in his pack, a radio that should not work but does. 3 rounds, 11 minutes. 4 days of blocked advance ended. The mocking stopped after that. Not because anyone formally acknowledged they had been wrong, not because a memo was written or a commendation was issued. The mocking stopped because the infantry moved, and when infantry moves in the bocage in the summer of '44, everyone in the chain knows what that means, and they know who made it happen. Hearst's radio worked. That's what he remembered. He was right to remember it that way. If this investigation gave you something you did not have before, not the mythology but the specific documented mechanics of how one man and one capacitor and one naval officer who chose to trust a voice on the radio changed the arithmetic of a 4-kilometer sector in Normandy, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the man who can see it is not always the man the manual says should be looking. Sometimes he is the man in the ditch with the radio that should not work. And sometimes that is exactly enough.